Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Better Minneapolis. I'm Terry White, and I'm here today with Frank Spring, who is the founding partner of Altum Insight and co-founder of Undaunted Ventures. And he specializes in sort of science-based methodologies to decode and construct political narratives. So I'm excited to talk to him today about some of the things that are happening in our world here in Minnesota. So welcome, Frank. Maybe you could add to that introduction if you would.
Sure, glad to. Terry, thank you for having me. And you got it exactly right. My specialty, I'm a narrative consultant. With my partners at Altum Insight, we use the wealth of scientific information and insight that we have about the role that stories play in the formation of people's identities and group behavior. You know how they form our identities, they form our attitudes, they shape our perception of the world around us, and how they drive those behaviors. So at Altum, we are a research firm, and our method is to understand how the stories that people are telling themselves about their lives, about their communities, about their country, almost always in a political context. At Undaunted, we use that same science. When I founded Undaunted a few years earlier, we use that same science to help advocates, usually political clients, but not always, tell their own stories. So they're kind of two stories, and I think we're going to talk about that both of these types of stories today. There are kind of two stories in politics. One is the story that a candidate or an advocate is telling about themselves to their audience, that they want their audience to find persuasive or motivational. And the other are the many overlapping stories that ordinary people, that ordinary audiences and voters are telling themselves all the time to help make sense of their world and tell them kind of, who am I, what is my identity, and what am I supposed to do next?
I'm still trying to figure all that out, so this will be good. Um, and you're in New Mexico, is that right? We're in New
That is correct.
Mexico.
I'm coming to you live from the North Valley of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Okay, all right. I lived in the sort of slummy university area for a while in Albuquerque, and I always thought that area just to the east in the mountains was really nice.
Yeah,
If you could
mountains are
afford,
beautiful.
is
Yeah.
that the Manzanos? Is that what that to the
The Sandia
east?
is immediately to the east
Sandy.
of
Okay.
Albuquerque, and the Manzano is immediately to the south. And for those who may not know, that is we're talking about the very southern tip of the Rocky Mountains. So if you sort of think about the Rockies, they run from Canada, all the way down, and they end right here.
Yeah. So I love living there, and then I lived in Santa Fe for a good long time, and I noticed that the Santa Fe Institute is still in action.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if you know anyone there. When I lived there, I worked on a political campaign for the Green Party,
Mhm.
and his name was Chris Moore. He became a city councilor in Santa Fe, and he worked at the Santa Fe Institute.
Yeah,
So.
it's been a long time since I've engaged with those folks, but I remember Chris Moore's campaign, and I remember him as a decent guy, a thoughtful person, I think.
Yeah, pretty smart. And I recently read about and we'll jump into the questions here soon, but there was an article just yesterday in the New York Times about WIP and the nuclear waste left over from the Cold War that's up in Los Alamos, where of course they invented the bomb. Um, and I've always found it so ironic that this just gorgeous, out of the way place, Los Alamos, has all this nuclear waste. It's so I don't know if you saw that story or heard about it there, but
I mean, I haven't seen that specific story, but yeah, nuclear waste. I mean, Albuquerque, New Mexico is full of nuclear bombs. There's a lot of Los Alamos obviously created them. Sandia National Laboratories right here in Albuquerque is a Department of Energy
mhm.
facility. They do an enormous amount of work, among other things, on nuclear capability. And the Waste Isolation Pilot Program, WIP, I think the first facility of it was in the southern part of the state, and it was our nuclear waste and other people's nuclear waste. And it was basically a paid dumping ground for nuclear waste. And that's been a political battle of various sorts since I was a child in New Mexico. And there are, good arguments for nuclear power. There are good arguments for using New Mexico as a storage ground for nuclear power. I think part of the thing that complicates that, to give it a more modern context, and this actually kind of came to a head a little bit, or was a little bit highlighted when the film Oppenheimer came out, and more, I think, to do with the efforts of one of our Congress people, Teresa Leger Fernandez. But there is still a legacy of nuclear material in New Mexico that is fundamentally unaddressed. The downwinders, as they're called, the
Mhm.
people whose families live downwind of the nuclear testing zones, caught, as you might imagine, a staggering amount of radiation that has, has sickened and killed them and killed their communities and has done an enormous amount of harm to those folks. And they have never really been properly recognized or had that harm properly redressed. And so I think beneath that question of what do we do with all this nuclear waste, what do we do with our nuclear weapons, where do we put all this stuff? Can we use New Mexico for it? Is this kind of unresolved question of, well, maybe, but what are you going to do about the people who've already been harmed by New Mexico's nuclear history? So that is still a live issue around here.
Yeah, I mean, that was the point of this article in the Times was just that, because the nuclear treaty with Russia has now expired, they were going to start making new nuclear cores, I guess, in Los Alamos. And so the state is suing the Department of Energy because they're like, why don't you clean up this old waste before you
Mm-hmm.
start making new waste? And so it seems like there's a bit of a battle going on there.
There certainly is, and that'll keep going. And I mean, that's not what this podcast is about. But we
Yeah.
could spend the afternoon talking about some of the crazy stories that have come out of Los Alamos during its early days of just people move. And some of this is probably apocryphal, but some of it isn't. People moving into the city, new scientists, new people arriving to staff the hospital or whatever, and discovering like hot cubes of metal in their garage and people turning up in hazmat suits and carrying them off with calipers. I mean, it was, nuclear material is much better handled now, but there is a long legacy of it being, it being a pretty cavalier process out here for a really long time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for indulging me there. I was really interested in hearing more about this idea of the way narratives shape the way we think about political events. And right now, obviously, Minnesota, Minneapolis in particular, is right at the center of um, sort of resisting what a lot of people call fascist um, increase in our federal government, and see ICE and what's happening here as one of those um, signs. So I wanted to hear, like, from your perspective, how do you think we got to this point that we're in right now, where people really do feel like we're under assault by fascism.
Sure. It's a great question. And it's one of those questions that it's really hard it's hard to say where do you start your story. And in what's one of the things we talk a lot about in narrative construction. I'd like to think I'm a reasonably good storyteller. Anyone who hears me tell a story or reads any sort of fiction I've written can tell me that. But in a professional or not if they don't think it's true. But in a professional capacity, I'm really more of a story engineer, and that's what we do at both Altima and Undaunted. Stories are to us a term of a scientific designation. They're not a term of art, and they refer to that a narrative has a number of effects on the human brain and has documented effects in human behavior and behavioral psychology. So when we construct a narrative and we think about a story, we think what are the component parts of this, and we're taking the various parts of a story and fitting them together, taking them apart, seeing if the story works or not. I say all of that because when we started this slide toward authoritarianism and fascism is a really interesting question. And we've done a number of studies at Altima over the last couple of years that would suggest that the beginning of that process really depends substantially on who you ask. There's also people who would deny it's happening altogether. But with respect to Minneapolis, we'll sort of take I'll give you the kind of the short story version of this, which is, I think it's very clear that this administration has as one of its essential premises the idea that I think they genuinely believe this, and this is me interpreting the public sentiment data and reading the tea leaves of what this administration does and how they talk about what they do. So what you're seeing here is some of it is backed by data and some of this is just me interpreting this, but I genuinely think this administration believes there is a silent majority of Americans who feel themselves besieged and afraid and adrift and disoriented and and unwelcome and frightened and angry in their own communities because and in their conception those people are all white, and that or mostly white, and their fear is triggered by the presence of a large number of migrants and non-white Americans, right? Like I think the administration is genuinely telling themselves that is the scenario out there. That what's wrong with America is a lot of people who aren't white and don't look like Donald Trump and Stephen Miller turned up and lived life a different way and thought about different things and acted differently, and that's a problem. And you can see this administration trying in various ways to act. That's certainly their thesis, right? And I think they believe that they have at one point believed, may still believe, that they had a majority on that. They did win an election while believing that, and so I think they naturally. So there is a kind of natural tendency, and this happens in political parties all over the world, where you win an election while believing something and while talking about some component part of it, and then you naturally think, oh, people believe this too, that we are the party of the majority. And as a result, this administration has been looking for various ways to execute that part of what they see as their mandate, which is, and this is a term that I despise in media, to implement a crackdown. But this is what a lot of the media has been calling it: a crackdown in Los Angeles or Portland or in Minneapolis, especially in Minneapolis. And the way they choose to target these places, I think, is substantially about ethnic minority populations, especially high immigrant populations. And there's also there's a smattering of the right wing conspiracy and fever swamp where a lot of the stories that animate the Republican Party come from. And so there has been this fever swamp conspiracy theory about Somalis and fraud, and this idea that just Minneapolis is a war zone. And I mean, I was just there over
Mhm.
the summer. It's fantastic. I had a great time. I ate extremely well, met a lot of great people. I saw no evidence of an ongoing civil war, but maybe I just missed it. Maybe it was happening somewhere else. So they have this sort of paranoid style, this conspiracy, their influence really, and their decision making really is influenced by this. And so the idea is we are going to so they're forever looking for a city to make an example out of, to put the fear into anyone who doesn't think like them, to certainly put the fear into immigrant communities and communities of color, and to satisfy what they perceive as the silent majority of Americans, particularly white Americans, who are yearning for someone to come up and come up and crack down on immigrants and ethnic minorities. And what they are finding in Minneapolis is that story is just flat wrong. Like, just that is there, that silent majority of people that they thought existed simply does not exist. And now the bottom is falling out of their political project as a result.
Well, one of the interesting parts of how we got where we are and is because of storytelling here, right? So to go back, there's been many stories about the fraud in the sort of more uh, established media here, the
Mhm.
Star Tribune and the Reformer and Sahan Journal. Um, so stories about fraud have been here, but they haven't been given a lot of weight, I guess.
Mhm.
And then this city journal, I think it's called, which is kind of uh, a more right wing media organization, wrote a story that uh, because of Somali fraud, Minnesota was funding Al-Shabaab, right?
Mhm.
Which there's no proof for that at all. This is one writer's conjecture, right? And but then Trump took that up and sent, I think, although all of a sudden Nick Shirley shows up. He gets
Mhm.
um, feted by the Republican Party here and given a list of Somali daycares to go do his thing with. And so then the whole story really blew up. And then the next thing you know, troops are in the streets, right?
Yeah.
So I just find it really interesting because there is a gap between what would be a logical response and what seems to be the narrative that they've tried to create to drum up a response here.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think of that arc there? And should we expect to see more um, sort of intentional uh, storytelling like that to suit the ends of the administration?
I would expect that we would. It is what is happening in Minneapolis, and we can kind of talk about the effect of the resistance they've encountered in a second. But you can see that this has taken them by surprise. The resistance has taken them by surprise. They are trying to figure out what to do with it and what to do with the way that has emboldened Democratic elected officials. I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to try more of this and try for the same playbook, but I do expect that you probably would. Past tends to be a good predictor of future behavior. But I think the right has historically been better storytellers than the left. And that really, I think, goes back particularly to Ronald Reagan, who, whatever else may be said about the man, was a master storyteller. He had very clear stories. And the thing about his stories is a good story in politics, there are a bunch of component parts of it. In Ultimate Undaunted, we use a 9-point model to build a narrative. Each of them is connected to some function of behavioral psychology or the cognitive neuroscience of story. You can build simpler ones. But the basic thing that you need to do is one of the critical components is you need familiar characters. Right? A good story has a familiar character, a familiar archetype. Either you know who the person is or you know kind of what type of person they are. So, for example, and I'll talk about Reagan very, very briefly, and then I'll bring it back to the present day. But when Reagan told stories about particularly the welfare queen, who was one of his favorite, sort of dominant
Hmm.
myths, there was a person that was based on. The whole concept, of course, was playing on racial anxiety. There was, the life of that person that it was based on is not what Reagan described, but it was a familiar archetype to the people that he was talking to because those people. That's a two-part story, the welfare queen. The first is, some miscreant who doesn't want to work and just wants to live off of, taxpayer largesse. This is almost invariably racially and gender coded. But that is a familiar, the layabout that just wants to live off of, off of the state. That was at the time a very familiar archetype to the people that Reagan was talking to. And that person is enabled by the inept bureaucrat who just gives money away and isn't very smart and can't think straight and doesn't know when they're being conned and doesn't care, right? And that is also another familiar archetype. And it's one of the reasons that his stories did incredibly well because he was talking to people he knew their story when he was telling it to them. So they recognized their characters, they recognized the narrative beats. He was telling them a familiar story and they loved him for it and they bonded with him over that. To the right wing now, Somali immigrants stealing money to give it to terrorists. That's a familiar story to some of them. That's a familiar type, right? Like, they're Muslim, they're from Africa. They're just like, there's obviously up to no good. But to the credit of this country, and particularly to the credit of the people of Minneapolis and Minnesota more broadly, that is not a familiar story. That
No.
is not, that's like that character is not a character that people think about. That's not a character. That's not something they recognize. It's not a behavior they think about. It's crazy. And so to undertake the violent occupation and the extraordinarily violent and I think patently criminal tactics that ICE has employed in pursuit of a story that no one understands is a political catastrophe. And I think they're only just beginning to get their heads around the beginning of how bad this could be for their political project, which doesn't mean they're going to stop or it doesn't mean they're not going to try it again. My guess is they will because I don't think they know any better, but maybe some of them will learn something. Who knows?
So, what do you see as being the lasting implications or to what's happened here, the social impact to institutions and civic participation, political engagement? I mean, I think at least in Minnesota, you're going to see a lot of people get out and vote in the midterms because they're so fired up. But I don't know if that's the same elsewhere in the country. But what do you see the lasting impacts of this as being?
A couple of them. What ICE did and CPB. The thing is, you can see in the public data the bottom falling out of Trump's immigration and border security, policy or platform really early. I mean, this, if you're sort of looking at approval on it, looking at his approval, number goes down starting very early this year, almost as soon as long before they arrive in Minneapolis for this. It is clear that people have not been on board with this kind of from the beginning. And I want to say one of the things that we found at Altum over the last couple of years, and particularly in 2024, when we were doing quite a bit of our methodology is, and I won't get into this in great detail, but the preferred methodology that we have in order to build our narrative models is called digital ethnography. We do a bunch of essentially individual deep interviews with people over the course of several days, with panels of people. And it's a great way of going deep and getting kind of textured insights into how people feel about themselves and their lives, their community. One of the things that we found was we found very limited anti-migrant sentiment. Even amongst Republicans, we found very limited anti-migrant sentiment. People were not mad at migrants. Most of the concern that we saw was this sense that the southern border specifically was out of control. And that is a belief that I think was there may have been truth to it, but not in the way that people imagined. And some of it was just a straight myth that was being sold by various elements of the conservative media, especially Fox News. And I bring all of this up to say that this, we found very limited anti-migrant sentiment. We found a lot of concern about control over immigration. So that's what they thought they were getting when Trump was elected. People who either voted for him on the basis of border security and immigration, or thought or were willing to tolerate him, thought, well, we're going to get the southern border back under control. And suddenly there are goons in masks pointing guns at children in American cities. That already started to erode his popularity. And we've seen two of the largest protests in American history on the No Kings days, particularly as a result of that, right? But what ICE did and what CPP did with the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy is they committed an incontrovertible moral injury. They inflicted a moral injury upon the American people. And I use this term not as a term of rhetoric, but again, this is a term of science. It comes from, really it's from cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a term that was originally used to describe something that happened with people returning, I think originally from Vietnam, but it's a war zone term. It's a term that's used when someone has seen a person who is in a position of authority in a high stakes situation, either commit a bad act or allow a bad act to happen without consequence. Those are the three component parts of a moral injury. Well, the American people, particularly the people of Minneapolis, have had a moral injury inflicted upon them with the outright killing of American citizens for no crime other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which was trying to do the right thing to protect their neighbors. Right. That is not something that the effect of that on politics, I don't think can be underestimated. That kind of clearly understood moral injury in politics is extraordinarily rare. So if you're sort of looking at what the effects on politics are likely to be, I think certainly people in Minneapolis, as you say, are likely to turn out and vote in the midterms. I think people in the rest of the country are going to turn out and vote in the midterms. I think there is a wide sense that we have to have some kind of revenge or retribution. There has to be some accountability for the moral injury that has been done to this country. I would not want to be a Republican running for essentially any office in this country right now. Only only the ones in the deep reddest parts are safe. And that's just the beginning of it. I think you would expect to see continued organic community-led resistance, because Los Angeles and especially Portland and now especially Minneapolis have taught us you don't need big organizations. You don't need single charismatic leaders. People can do this themselves and can turn back the tide on this, or can at least take a stand against this kind of moral injury in a way that protects our neighbors and demands and maybe achieves some degree of accountability. So I would expect that that's going to be the legacy of this. I think it's going to be a horrible year for Republicans on account of this issue specifically, among other things. And then I think there's going to be a long tail of community. I hope there'll be a long tail of community organizing that exists almost outside of the partisan political context.
Well, we had one Republican candidate for governor drop out.
The smart one.
Right. And because he basically said there's no way a Republican can win a statewide election here. But when you were talking about sort of how people aren't necessarily anti-migrant, I do remember it seemed like they were able to create a caravan of people that were supposedly going across the border. And then it seemed like the election happened, and then you never heard about the caravan again.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the caravan was a great symbol. And I think that they misunderstood. This is a really interesting, because Republicans don't usually do this, fundamentally misunderstanding the stories that people are telling themselves about their lives and communities. With all respect to my colleagues in the industry, and I have certainly been guilty of this for a large chunk of my career, that's a Democratic trick, right? To assume that people know what we are talking about and who we're talking about when we talk about a policy, we tell a story, right? That has been one of, I think, the sins of the political industry for a long time in the party. Um, but the Republicans really messed up on this because with the caravan, what they were playing on, and successfully, was this fear that it's out of control. That just this huge number of people are just going
Mhm.
to drive into the country, and we won't know where they are, and we won't know, who they are, and we won't know what they're up to, and they're just going to appear. They're just going to, sort of they're just going to vanish off into the country, and there's nothing we can do about it. We found a fair amount of anxiety about that sort of thing when we were talking to people in 2024. The idea is like people are just pouring across. We have no idea who they are or what they're here for. But it was only a small sliver of Republicans that really thought, and those people are bad people. Like
Mhm.
we don't want this to happen because they're bad. It was mostly just like we just should know the sort of modal response. We should know who they are and where they're going and what they're planning on doing. Which, whatever else you may say, is not a completely unreasonable belief for an immigration policy, that you should know who's coming into your
Yeah.
country and kind of, what their plans are and where they're likely to be. That doesn't have to be an overtly hostile or punitive process. It certainly can be, and it was long before any of this was a twinkle in Donald Trump's eye. But it doesn't. But that is not an unreasonable view, and that we saw just the need to reassert control over the border, so we know who's coming in, we know where they're going to be, we know what they're up to, and then have a nice orderly process to let people in. That was the bedrock that we actually found. Like most America, and then just this is a broad sweeping statement, but it's backed up by the public sentiment research, by the research that we ourselves done. Most Americans have this kind of capability of separating immigrants into two categories: the good and the bad. They really, really want the good. They think most immigrants are good. They think a very small number of immigrants are bad, and those immigrants should be deported. If you That is not fundamentally anti-migrant sentiment, because this administration flips that, and they think most migrants are bad, if not all migrants are bad, by the very definition of being a migrant. That makes you a bad person. To Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff of the White House, to a bunch of other people in the Republican Party who are driving this agenda, merely being an immigrant makes you a bad person, and that's just not where Americans are. It's not a majority position. It is a fringe position in American politics, and it's driving a lot of the administration's most visible agenda, and you can see the political results already.
Another story where I think that they missed understanding where the public was is they once we had the killings occur here and they had Christy Nome and people out there saying these people were domestic terrorists.
Yeah,
I mean, the fact that we have so much video of what happened and people could look at it and hear the story that was coming from these elected officials, or she's not elected, but it didn't. They could see right away that there was the story was a lie, right?
yeah.
And I think it seems like the Republicans really underestimated the moral injury, as you say, that would cause, because people got more angry after listening to them as opposed to less.
That is absolutely right. The crime itself is the first injury, you're absolutely right. The attempted cover up, the just naked lie, the pissing on your leg and telling you it's raining. That is a bad enough injury unto itself. And they do this all the time on economic policy. I mean, they're hilarious clips that periodically float around social media of, someone from the administration, often the Treasury Secretary or someone of that sort, telling you about, the ag secretary, telling you, how great prices are and how easy it is to put together an affordable meal at a time when groceries are catastrophically
Hmm.
expensive and people are hurting, right? So they've already kind of taken a stock in trade of going to people and telling them, oh, up is down, day is night, and that thing you're experiencing is not what you're experiencing. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? That gets so much worse if you are trying to perpetrate a horrendous and injurious lie, in defense of having just committed a murder in broad daylight. Like you're in a really bad, even leaving aside the moral position there, politically, you're in a horrible spot if you're trying to do that. And one of the things that we see now, I was just reading about this before we got on this call. One of the things that we see now, this, I think maybe the first time I've seen this, is it is ICE walking back its support for its agents. They're looking at that
Mm,
incident where there was a where they accused they accused two men of having attacked ICE agents
right.
with a
Yeah.
broom and something else, and one of the agents shot them in the leg, shot one of them in the leg, and their position has always been, well, this was an attempted murder, and these agents are defending their lives. And they're now the position of the department is shifting, and actually turns out these officers may have lied, and they're being put on administrative leave. That may be a sea change in how they're handling this, because that is the first time that I think, have seen them admit that any agent involved in any of these operations might be at fault for anything. And the risk they are running here is, if the whole appeal of ICE to its new recruits, to a lot of its members, to the limited number of Americans who support this, is they are meant to be beyond any accountability. The whole point of this is they are meant to commit just unfathomable depredations and injuries against innocent people, which they do all the time, and there's never going to be any consequence for it. That's the absolute lockdown Donald Trump Kirsten Noem guarantee. You can do
Hmm.
anything you want. You will never face a moment of consequence. How a couple of these guys potentially facing some real consequence for this, or having been caught lying very obviously, how them facing some degree of consequence will affect kind of ICE as an institution, their recruitment, what's left of their morale. I don't really know, but it's like, I don't think this is a tenable situation, bluntly. You've got too many angry people on one side of the American people, and you've got too many people dependent upon that promise of total lack of accountability on the other. And I don't think they can keep it up.
Yeah, we'll see because they've definitely widened, I think, what you referred to as a trust gap.
Yeah.
And I worry that as more of these things happen, the less people believe in institutions, the less they believe in elected officials. And I feel like what we're seeing is actually people bypassing mainstream media, bypassing these other voices and going to the person on the street with their cell phone and that
Mhm.
becoming the real truth. Do you see that happening? And what does that mean for us having sort of a unifying institutions and press like in the future?
So the short-term outlook for faith in kind of unified press, I think, is pretty bad. I mean, we're watching legacy media die before our eyes. I mean, the Washington Post was just taken out back and shot as an institution last
Yeah,
week.
that
It's
was
about
terrible. Yeah.
45% of its reporters have been laid off. They said it was 30. It's actually closer to 45 or 50. So that place is effectively done as a newspaper, which is a wild thing to say, given what it has kind of meant in the role it's played. CBS News kind of likewise. It's sort of circling the drain. There are a few others. Anyway, I bring this up because, yeah, people go to we're sort of living in this age of citizen journalism, and that is enormously dangerous, because journalism is it's a real practice. It's a real field for a reason. I mean, it is it's the people who practice it and practice it well take enormous pride in their work, and understanding how you do your human best to tell truth from fabrication or myth, and to present that in a way that is fair and comprehensible. And we're in the midst of a generational failure of particularly legacy media to understand how to do that in the context of a political tendency like the MAGA Republican era, in which truth and shame are just not concepts that really form any part of that political tendency. So we've been watching legacy media struggle with this for a while. I think, though, that there will be another act to this. So the short term for legacy media, for unified media, for media institutions, is real bad. But I think you're already starting to see the rise of kind of media co-ops. Like Heartland Media is a good example of this, or just from kind of sports and culture perspective, Defector is a really good example of this. These are, media institutions that are worker owned. Many of them came out of the wreckage of legacy or established media outlets that were bought by private equity or by billionaires or by someone that didn't value what media and journalism is about, which is about uncovering interesting storytelling and compellingly, and giving your audience an opportunity to understand their world better. So these institutions, I think we're witnessing a kind of an extinction level event for a lot of American media, the model of which has expired, and which they hastened usually through their own decisions. And we are watching a kind of organic birth of kind of a return to journalism. We're just going to
Hmm.
write articles about communities, and people are going to subscribe to read those things, and we're going to make some money, but not a lot, and we're going to call it journalism. And that has worked before, and it'll work again.
Hmm.
But I think we are in the interregnum right now between those two things. That's it. And I grant
Yeah.
I'm a bit of an optimist on that.
Okay.
There are a lot of reasons to believe that might not happen, but I happen to think that's the direction that we're going. That in 10 years will be, we'll have a number of kind of new institutions that look a lot like, they won't look exactly like, but look a lot like old newspapers. They'll probably be regional, and they'll have journalists who get paid to investigate stories and write.
So along those lines, Minnesota has a ban on using AI to manipulate videos in politics, right? And I obviously write stories and send them out. But what is AI's future in terms of journalism? Because it seems like I've already seen companies that are using AI to just generate massive numbers of podcasts. They're
Mhm.
using them to go out and aggregate stories from other news services and make newsletters and send them out and this and that. So, how would you recommend for me, who's, trying to make it as an independent journalist, if you will, commentator, what should I expect is going to happen with AI, and how worried, I guess, should we be that it's going to be used more and more to manipulate people's opinions and generate stories that may or may not be true for and where we don't know what the intention is of those stories. So it really seems like AI is just giving free rein right now to try and figure out and generate stories.
Yeah, it's concerning. I think there's sort of two paths that this could take. And we're straying a little bit out from my area of expertise here, but I actually can cite a study that we conducted recently that'll support some of this. And the study that we conducted recently was, we talked to a bunch of rural folks in Nebraska, rural voters in Nebraska, and this is what we would call a political ethnography. So we didn't go in asking about any specific issue. We just kind of wanted to know, how do their political identities form? Again, what stories were they telling themselves about their lives, their communities, their country? What did they expect? What had happened? How do they account for those differences and so forth? What they wanted to talk about was AI.
Hmm.
And we didn't ask them about, we didn't set out to ask them about this. That was what was on their mind. That's what they wanted to talk about, and how much they hated it. There were a few folks who were, more or a little bit optimistic about the effect it might have on the American economy. Almost no one had anything good to say about the effect it would have on American society. And their resistance, again, these are rural folks. Their resistance was values based. They had
Hmm.
worries about the effect that AI would have on the American economy, but mostly they were worried about its effect on people. That they valued interpersonal connection, and this will come back to the media point in a second. They valued interpersonal connection enormously. This is really, they had a rural identity was one of the most intact and active identities of any group that we have studied, right? It was as it an active identity to us is one that tells you kind of, what is your relationship to other groups? What are you supposed to do now? How do who are we and what do we do? Is a really like, if it can answer those questions, that's a really active identity. Rural is an extremely active identity. And again, it's based on this, they like to know people, they like to show respect to people and have people know them and respect them. AI is an affront to that, because it creates this unreality. And people would talk about, these weren't anti-tech folks. They talked about the effect of technology on farming and how it's improved their efficiency and how it has enabled them to connect to people who they otherwise wouldn't be as connected to, family and friends who are farther away. But they were very concerned about AI creating a world of unreality in which kids can't critically think and can't tell what's real from what's not, and people are mad and divided all the time. And they really kind of saw it as being like social media on steroids. I think that, and the public, our finding was unusual because we found this values-based thing. For the most part, when political parties have talked about AI, the people who are critical of it have tended to be critical on the basis of its possible economic impact, on the basis of data centers and their effect on the communities around them, and to a certain degree on child safety, although Republicans have been more vocal about that than Democrats. But I bring this up because I think the dislike of AI is stronger, certainly, than anyone in the AI industry anticipated that it would be. I think they were, talking about the stories we tell ourselves. I think they substantially told themselves that they were selling the next iPhone. That
Hmm.
everyone was just going to have, like, the next smartphone, that everyone was going to have it. Everyone was going to have it. People were going to love it. It was going to change their lives. It was going to, people were going to get hooked on it. And, and it was sometimes with all the kind of darker implications that carries. And what has happened is actually people don't like it at all. They don't like it. They don't trust it. They don't like or trust its work. So, in terms of what might happen to media and the kind of larger information and entertainment ecosystem, I can see it going a couple of different ways. Right now, the public data and some anecdotal data would suggest that, especially for younger generations, their tendency is just not to believe anything that's put in front of their eyes right now, that everything is AI. And that is real bad because it does make it hard to communicate true information, right? You don't want that. That's not where you want to be. On the other hand, a degree of profound skepticism is certainly better than credulity in a moment like this, because there is a ton of AI nonsense that is being created specifically to inflame and to do harm.
Well, one example of that, I'm sure you probably saw the photo. We had an activist here, Nikema Levy Armstrong, that was arrested with Don Lemon for going into a church and doing a protest because the pastor was a field officer for ICE. She was arrested, and the picture that was released by the administration darkened her skin and showed her crying, but
Yeah.
that was not the actual photo. And so when I hear stories like, well, people are afraid of AI, and it's like, yeah, I mean, there's good reason for that. I mean,
There's
if
every
some,
reason to be.
yeah,
Yeah. And forgive me, but and this is just what AI can do. And that's not that capability is not a new one.
yeah,
It's just, I mean, a number of, a number of media outlets famously darkened Barack Obama when he ran for president of the United States.
yeah, that's a good
uh, you know,
point.
or
Yeah,
you know, or
yeah,
or Trayvon Martin, and for that matter, there were, during, particularly in the middle of the last decade, there's a tremendous amount of what was then called disinformation, still mis and disinformation, really disinformation, that were images that were being produced by, troll farms, mostly out of the Eastern Bloc, that were producing, ludicrous video and ludicrous images. One of my favorite ones during Colin Kaepernick's protest of kneeling during the national anthem, there was a video that made the rounds. It was written up because of its ridiculousness of that was purported to have been taken in the locker room of the Seattle Seahawks that showed, all pro defensive end Michael Bennett waving a burning American flag while Pete Carroll, the head coach, danced around. And it was the dumbest thing possible, right? It was absolutely absurd. It got nowhere even on social media because no one believed that Michael Bennett or the Seattle Seahawks or Pete Carroll are, violently and, anti-American revolutionaries, right? Like it was the dumbest thing imaginable. So this kind of, like, that was a handcraft, that was artisanal garbage, right? What is happening now is AI slop can produce all of this at a, at speed and just flood our airwaves with it. And so I suspect what we will see is a period of profound skepticism that I hope will give way to a regulatory environment, because that's what it's going to take. A regulatory environment that controls the extent to which AI can appear on our screens in the ways that it can, and that will provide various markers for us to identify what is AI and what isn't. As it becomes harder and harder to choose. And I think so. There is a possibility that ultimately the AI wave in media could wash back out again.
mhm.
That's an optimistic view. The pessimistic view on this is, and I wouldn't want to handicap the two of them. As you can tell, I tend to be pretty optimistic in most things, but I wouldn't want to have to pick between which two is more likely. The pessimistic view is that AI slop in entertainment and news just becomes a feature of the landscape, right? That mostly it is just a wash, that our screens are just awash in trash, and that good writing, good scripted entertainment, actual, real, proper information, which is hard to produce and expensive relative to just having a machine churn out whatever garbage it thinks is important, that will become a kind of, like, I heard someone describe it recently as like the new organic food, that will
Mhm.
have kind of organic information and organic entertainment that'll be more expensive, but you can pay for it and you can get the good stuff. And people who can't afford it or don't care to are just going to get the synthetic slop. That is a much more dystopian vision, and I wouldn't want to pick between the two of them. I have a lot of hope for the AI kind of rolls back out of the information and entertainment ecosystem as it becomes clear that Americans want and people. This isn't just an American phenomenon. That people want something real. I think that instinct is pretty powerful. So if I had to pick, I would say I think the more optimistic scenario is probably a touch more likely, but it could easily go the other way.
Well, one thing I'm seeing, and this isn't totally related to AI, although maybe the algorithms that put different stories at the top of your queues, is it doesn't seem like um, rural America and what's happening in the cities are getting the same information. And or if they are, they're seeing it through a lens that is so completely different. They interpret the same things in different ways. And one example of that is really what's happened here in Minneapolis. I mean, when you look at the polling, the rural people were much more uh, I guess, upset at protesters and feeling like they needed to get out of the way and then let ICE do their job. That was kind of a,
Mhm.
whereas if you're in this city, a lot more people are like, you don't understand what's going on. They're running around picking people at random off of the street, and this is violent and dangerous. And they were, even now you can see it in the polls rural America much more accepting of what's happened in the cities, much less so. How do you see, or is there even a story to craft on that brings rural and urban divide together? I mean, immigration is one topic, but then there's guns, there's public spending. I mean, you see in the newspaper here where if you look at the comments, people who live outside the city just think we're totally nuts in the city.
Yeah.
So, do we ever have like an issue or a way of talking and bringing the states together more, or is this just the way it's going to be?
Well, I mean, man with a hammer sees everything is a nail, but among the opportunities for that is what we just found in AI. There is a real coalition between rural and urban on this.
Hmm.
There's a coalition all over the country on this on a values basis. That's the critical thing. It has to be done on the values basis that this is an affront to the way we want to be in the world. It's an opportunity to demonstrate one of the first serious opportunities in my lifetime for particular, the progressives, particularly Democrats, but any progressive person to demonstrate that they share the same kind of or a similar value set to rural people. One of the things that we have found in the rural identity is that the other is urban people,
Hmm.
and sometimes
Yeah.
sometimes there's hostility there, but mostly it's just kind of they're them and they do their thing, and that's fine. But I wouldn't listen to them, and I wouldn't ask their opinion on anything. Rural is what makes us what we are. That and then and that certainly echoes my experience with my own family, but there is an opportunity, and again, and AI isn't going to be the only one of these, but it's the one that immediately comes to mind where the way that the rural people express this fear of AI and hostility to it as on a values basis, not on a material basis, but on a values basis. We're protecting our way of life here. That is not substantially different, I think, from what you will find in suburban and urban areas. And it would be an opportunity for a political party or an individual politician, a political organizing task to bring these communities together. Because one of the things that we are also finding with particular, and I'll give you another example of this, the backlash to ICE, may not be knitting up rural and urban communities. Although I do note that rural communities are extraordinarily critical of ICE
Hmm.
relative to their usual relationship to law enforcement. Um, so ICE isn't doing all that well out there either. But what we've seen is that there are communities, that have been bound together within urban and suburban areas that normally do not form a political coalition. So you're looking at, differences in education, differences in income, differences in sort of political identity, coming together to turf out ICE. That's to do one specific thing, but it is also an opportunity to see in each other more similarity than difference. So I think there is a non-zero chance that there could be some kind of the beginnings of some kind of new political coalition that may emerge out of these things. But the biggest opportunity, if you're thinking about urban and rural right now, I genuinely think is AI.
It's funny and a better than non-zero chance. Well,
Mhm.
that's something.
Listen, man. I can't. All we can, we could, you can't guarantee anything, but a better, as you say, a better than non-zero chance is something.
And I don't know if you've seen this in any of your work, but Minneapolis itself is kind of an interesting political spectrum because we essentially have left of center and then very far left, even so there's a few anarchists running around. And that's like the whole entire political spectrum, right? There's like maybe a 5%, 10% Republican. Um, presence in the city. They don't hold any offices whatsoever. Um, the only presence in this state of Republicans is when you get into the um, state legislative positions outside of the cities, right? That's it. So, but it also seems like that's kind of a point of weakness for Democrats when it spills outside of the state because eh, it's kind of a weak party in that it's constantly fighting itself, right? You constantly have people on further left on the spectrum sort of attacking people that are closer to the center. And it makes it really hard to like move forward on any like substantive issues like how do we spend public money, even how do we build roads? Everything kind of becomes a point of contention. Have you seen that pop up anywhere else in your work or?
Sure. That's a at the local level, that's a perennial concern. And I will say the Republicans don't have it as badly as a problem in states where they're the ones who are substantially in control because you don't have to argue over how you're going to spend money on roads if you don't believe in spending money on roads at all.
Hmm.
But so there's a little bit more ideological commonality there. But but wherever you have significant one party dominance, you're going to have absurd infighting. You're going to have blue on blue or red on red. I think the big schism that I see that I think is going to shape political argument and kind of shape the direction of the country within the Democratic Party, it isn't really kind of left versus center. There's some of that, but I actually don't think that's the dividing line anymore. And this is not, I'm not the only person who talks about this. It really is kind of the institutionalists versus the reformers and the sort of the Democrats who think that if we just get the right people into the existing institutions, that we can fix this, that we can go back to normal, that we're going to be okay. Versus Democrats that look at this and think these institutions are how we got to this awful place, and they themselves will have to be fixed, possibly through quite radical measures. Some of them broken, many of them remade. Trump administration is doing a pretty good job breaking stuff already, so we may inherit some pieces that we can put back together in a way that we like better. But I think that really is within the Democratic Party. I think that is going to be the next dividing line, and that's going to manifest as what our relationship is with capital and how we deal with finance,
Hmm.
because you're going to have some stuff there. There's going to be some social stuff, but I think for the most part, we're actually going to find it pretty easy to get past a lot of that, at least at the national level. The place where people are going to be tearing strips out of each other is which of these institutions do we have to break and rebuild, and how should we rebuild them versus people who think no, we've got to put all the breaking behind us. The institutions are fine, we just have to get the right people in. That is a possibly a sundering moment for the party. And I think bluntly, I think the institutionalists are a clear minority and clear and dwindling minority.
Hmm. Well, maybe we close things out on this question, which is do we abolish ICE altogether
Yes,
and
that's an
or as
easy
a,
one. The answer is yes.
as opposed to reform, right? Because
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot of people who still who think if I was looking at a picture today where they showed ICE tactics 10 years ago versus ICE tactics now. And the argument is like, well, we can go back to what it was like 10 years ago, can't we? But then I also see a lot of people saying, no way, the whole institution's gotten so corrupt. We need to get rid of it and have some other new border patrol. So where do you stand on that?
I mean, you could tell by my earlier answer, ICE has to be abolished, and I'll give
Yeah.
you a good and I'll give you a good and not altogether optimistic assessment of that comparison there. But this is not a comparison that I use lightly. But ICE is substantially like the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force of Northern Ireland that was abolished after the Good Friday Agreement because it was so clearly associated with a regime of repression and open crime against Northern Ireland's Catholic population and Republican population. The RU's like the idea was this institution has been so bigoted, so violent, and so clearly in collusion with with loyalist paramilitaries that it can never that as long as it wears that name and has the same people in it, it can never be trusted. It just
Mhm.
it can't it doesn't there's nothing to be it can't be retrained. that that degree of kind of prejudice and violence is in its bones and has been for quite some time. They reformed it as the Police Service of Northern Ireland. A lot of the same people work for it. Police service in Northern Ireland is not perfect. There have been some very real concerns that a lot of that kind of anti-Republican, anti-Catholic violence is still there. We do there is and I think the question for us with particular respect to ICE, it is very clear to me that the violence, the repression, the bigotry is in ICE's bones. This is not an institution that can be saved. This, for God's sake, they've killed Americans in broad daylight and claimed that they were in danger. You can't come back from a moment like that. You just can't. No one will ever trust them again. And I know we're at time here, but it's worth pointing out that ICE for a long time has been largely sort of disliked and distrusted within the law enforcement community because they're seen as being too heavy-handed, hyper-aggressive, a bunch of Yahoo thugs who disrupt the actual act of police work. I mean, there are such things as international criminal organizations that operate in this country, sometimes with people who are documented, sometimes people who aren't. Those should be, there's traffic in drugs and human beings and everything else, and those need to be disrupted, right? Like there's a social good to be done by identifying those people and arresting them and prosecuting them. That takes police work, not thuggery, actual police work.
Yeah.
Detection and hard work. And ICE was always sort of seen as a liability to that because they would cause whole communities to dislike them and distrust them. CPB likewise. So I think, and also ICE is a young organization. It's not even 25 years old. And so I think the real question is, or at least the Homeland Security is a young organization. It's not even 25 years old. And I think ICE in its present incarnation was created along with it. And so the question is, what do we need to disrupt international crime? What is the right agency to be vested with that? And that has to be disaggregated from how do we have an orderly immigration process that is fair to the people who are trying to get in and serves the need of the country to know who's coming in and what their plans are. Those are the questions that need to be asked, but the answer to neither of them is having ICE stick around.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in all your police procedurals and all that stuff, there's always like tension between the different departments, right? And whether it's county or city police. And here, I mean, we have this interesting setup where it's taken a long time for the Minneapolis Police Department to gain back any trust because we went through George Floyd, right?
Mhm.
And this incident, what's happened now has kind of, I would say, set the process back because it's put the police in that awkward position of having to uh, be the go-between between, say, ICE and protesters or just regular citizens, out doing their business. And, it's, I would say, not fair to them because they always have to now question, okay, am I following the separation agreement or how should I act? And I think there's almost no way that they're going to act that they're going to please everybody. And so that's just one of the other consequences of what's happened here in my eyes. I don't
It
know.
seems like a fairly generous assessment. I mean, I think, and this is easy for me to say, but it's worth, I mean, the question they have to ask themselves is, who do I work for? Do I work for the people of Minneapolis or do I work for ICE?
Yeah, I mean, well, here it's that, say, take the sheriff's office has been, have arrested people at rallies and stuff where they've been called out and they've been, they declare like this rally is no longer legal. You need to disperse. People don't disperse, and then they end up arresting them, right? And I guess my point is more that like if ICE wasn't here, the protest wouldn't be going on. Sheriff's Department wouldn't be put in that place. That's
Sure, sure. Again, you're being more fair-minded than I would be, and that does you credit.
okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think we covered a lot of interesting topics. Is there anything that you wanted to add before I turn us off?
Yeah. Yes, I would. I want to just talk to your listeners in the Minneapolis area for just 1 second, if I may. The whole premise of this from the Trump perspective is their deep-seated belief, this entire political project of cruelty to people who are different than the way they think people should be, is based on the idea that we don't want to protect each other and that we won't. And what the people of Minneapolis have shown over the last few weeks is just how wrong they are and how far ordinary Americans will go to protect each other just because that's who we are as a people. And we've seen strong resistance, good resistance in other cities, but you, the good people of Minneapolis, have really demonstrated exactly how deep we will dig to protect each other, and to send that message in the way that you have at enormous risk and cost to yourselves. It just represents, I think, the best of what this country is always trying to be, and we owe you a debt of thanks. So, from someone very far away who's only just observed this, thank you for what you have done and what you continue to do. It's inspiring.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an example for people across the country, right?
Yes,
So
I hope
you're,
so.
yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.